Distinguished moderators and members of the House, in moving today's proposition, which states that the SARS CoV-2 virus is likely man made, I will begin with a disclosure of conflict of interest. In January of 2020, when we wrote our best selling book on the coronavirus, we postulated that it was more likely natural than man made. Our assumption was predicated on two declarations. The scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology declared rather vociferously at the outset that this had to be a natural virus. In addition to that, a group of distinguished international scientists wrote a letter to the Lancet in which they were insistent that this had to be a natural virus. We chose naively and erroneously, as it turned out to be, to believe them. Since then, members of the House, there has been a compelling body of evidence to cause us to conflict what we had earlier declared and see this now as probably a man-made virus. Allow me to present that evidence to you. We shall present it in the form of viral evidence, intermediary host evidence, disease evidence, circumstantial evidence, gain of function evidence, and finally, computational evidence. On the viral front, we see that this particular coronavirus is very uncharacteristic of other coronaviruses in that in the dreaded S protein, it has a furin cleavage site unique to this virus, and this cleavage site allows it affinity to the ACE2 receptor and hence easy access into the human body. In a representation of the virus, we see in its subset, when we look at the S protein, that there is a furin cleavage site that I alluded to a moment ago. And this site is the hallmark of this virus. In none of the 7 naturally occurring viruses which come close to SARS CoV-2 do we see the furin cleavage site. And we shall later see that in 2017, the Wuhan Institute of Virology published a paper saying that they were able to engineer this into the virus. Now, the intermediary host has not been identified despite 20 months. This is unprecedented. The host that comes closest to harboring the virus are the horseshoe bats in the Yunnan province, of which we shall talk a little later. And in fact, the Wuhan Institute of Virology has been interested in researching the horseshoe bat and its virus for a few years. When we look at the intermediary hosts, we see that the camel was identified as the host of MERS in 9 months. It took only 3 months to identify the palm civet in SARS and merely a week to identify the pig as an intermediary host of swine flu. And yet, with all the advances in technology, the enormous interest generated in the current pandemic, for 20 months, we have not been able to identify the intermediary host. I'd like the members of the House to ponder whether it is possible that there is no intermediary host and it's been a direct leak from a lab. When we look at the horseshoe bat that I spoke about a little while ago, we see that its location is 1400 kilometers away from Wuhan. Its migratory path is no more than 50 kilometers. Moreover, in the month of September, it hibernates inside a cave. And even if we were to take the preposterous theory that somehow when it was migrating, it chose to move beyond its 50 kilometers, went 1400 kilometers to Wuhan, we see that nobody has been infected along the path. When we look at the disease, the one thing that stands out is that several scientists and technicians in the Wuhan Institute of Virology fell ill to a mysterious illness, very much like COVID-19, a few weeks before it became an epidemic outbreak. Now let us look at the circumstantial evidence, which is indeed interesting. It is standard protocol to inform the WHO immediately whenever there is a disease outbreak. The Chinese did not inform them for 16 very critical weeks. Moreover, once they informed, they come in and inspect the site immediately, as indeed they did when they came to Wuhan. They were not allowed any inspection for 16 months. Excuse me. Finally, in January 2021, they were only permitted to see secondary sources, which means they were not allowed on the site. They had to sit far away and look at the photographs and other evidence which the Chinese chose to present them selectively. Moreover, from day one, there was widespread censorship. One example is Dr. Li Van Liang, a young ophthalmologist who died, who was terrorized and censored only for informing a small group of his classmates that a mysterious illness was spreading. We've dedicated our book to him. Now, the critical evidence on gain of function. This is the research that enables us to add the function of lethality to the infectivity, which is already widespread. We know the coronavirus causes the common cold. And in 2011, this engineering had occurred in the H5N1 virus and was published. The NIH in Washington and the Wuhan Institute of Virology have been collaborating for years. And in 2017, they publicly disclosed their ability to engineer this by putting in the furon site that I alluded to some time ago, and moreover, permit, excuse me, human cell infection and increase cell death. We wrote 2 pages, excuse me, in our gain of function in our coronavirus book, talking about the probability of this happening, not realizing it has probably actually occurred. And finally, members of the House, here's the computational evidence. When we feed in all the data into artificial intelligence, which has no bias whatsoever, we see that in over 99.5% of variables, it clearly indicates a probability of a laboratory origin. With that, members of the House, I rest my case and ask you to judiciously look at the evidence and cast your vote accordingly. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleague for a basic undergraduate lecture to this distinguished House on epidemiology. I had assumed the House was aware of it and had instead focused on the compelling evidence to indicate that the SARS CoV-2 virus is indeed likely to be man-made. The most compelling argument from the other side has been that there is a 96% overlap in the genome of this virus compared to other naturally occurring viruses. I'd like to point out that there is exactly the same 96% overlap in the genome of the human and the chimpanzee. The remaining 4% is vital, and hence we are not chimpanzees. As to the backbone structure of the virus, the backbone structure of humans, cats, mice, very similar. That doesn't reduce us to mice. As to the toolkits for the gain of function, they have very much been in existence for over a decade. We pointed out the paper that was published in 2011 and the paper published in 2017 by the Wuhan Institute of Virology, indicating that they had already accomplished what we are speculating today, 4 years later. As to the horseshoe bat hypothesis, as we have pointed out, we'd have to believe that a bat which hibernates in winter and goes no more than 50 kilometers, chose not to hibernate, managed to go 1400 kilometers to Wuhan and did not infect anybody along the way. I'm glad Luc Montagnier was brought up. In fact, he is the one scientist, the one Nobel laureate who has consistently maintained that this is man-made and not of natural origin. And finally, as opposed to the 16 references that we have pointed out, the compelling published literature is a letter written by the same people who had protested in the beginning and perhaps protested a bit too loudly. I am going to share the letter with you. Allow me, and here it is. And we can see for ourselves that they dishonestly claimed no competing interests in the Lancet letter in February 2020. In the letter that they published last week, the very same people were forced to admit their conflicts of interest, and they go almost a page long. They're all conflicted, all connected with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Are we going to choose to believe a letter written by these scientists, or are we going to choose to believe the compelling evidence that we have seen? Members of the House, it is now for us to decide. let us see this analogous to a fire that has engulfed the world. It has affected all of us. Our brethren have died in it. The place where the fire originated, they have maintained secrecy. They have not allowed access to an inspection. And they expect us to believe that this was natural, as though lightning or some other event caused it. It is for this House to vote judiciously, and in doing so, send a signal that while all the evidence is not in, at least the evidence that is there so far makes a compelling case for a man made origin to the SARS CoV 2 virus. And as a corollary to that, we are watching gain of function research because, in the end, it affects us all. With that, I rest my case.